They were just a few miles past Blanding when the same truck showed up again. No headlights, no turn signal, just the shape of it slipping into view in the rear-view mirror. Emily had her camera in her lap, humming something under her breath. I remember thinking, why is he still behind us? We hadn't seen another car for nearly 20 minutes. By the time I called 911, I already knew in my gut we weren't going to make it to Reno. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your hometown or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Linda Garrett. I was 45 that fall. I lived on the east side of Denver, just me and my daughter Emily. We had a small 2-bedroom apartment, nothing fancy, but it was home. I'd been working at Valley View Dental for close to 8 years. Same parking spot, same coffee mug, same Tuesday crossword folded into my lunchbox. Emily was 16, bright, independent. The kind of girl who didn't just take pictures, she saw things. Shadows on brick walls, reflections in puddles. She was saving up for a better lens. Said she wanted to photograph the desert at sunset. We'd been planning the trip for months. Just the two of us driving from Colorado to Nevada to see my sister Caroline. It wasn't about sightseeing. We just needed space. Quiet. A few days of road trip music, gas station snacks, and no one asking anything of us. But the peace we had, what little there was, had already started to fray. The first letter came on a Tuesday. No stamp, no return address. Just Linda in black block letters on the front. I found it slipped under our apartment door. Inside a single line. I know Emily walks to school at 7:45 every morning. I stared at it for a long time. Then I folded it back up, put it in a Ziploc bag, and called the non-emergency line. A patrol officer came by that evening. Young woman, nice enough. She took my statement, nodded a lot, but I could tell there wasn't much they could do. No threat, no signature, just a creepy note. She told me to save the letter. Said to call again if it escalated. It did. A week later, another envelope appeared, this one with no name, just tucked neatly under our doormat. Emily looked beautiful in her red sweater yesterday. She sat alone at lunch reading about photography. That's when I stopped sleeping through the night. By the fourth letter, I'd changed the locks, moved Emily's school drop-off to a different block, and started carrying pepper spray in my purse. Emily thought I was overreacting, but she also stopped walking to school alone. The last note came the Thursday before we left. One word, handwritten. Soon. That night I packed our bags without saying a word. We were going to Reno. No more delays. We'd leave after her Friday classes, take Highway 191 through Utah, and drive through the night if we had to. What I didn't realize, what I couldn't realize, was that someone already knew our route. Because someone had been watching long before the letters ever started. And 3 nights later, out in the dark, silence past Moab, a voice on the other end of the 911 call would hear. What I never wanted Emily to say. Mom, they're getting closer. To be continued in Part 2. The Night of Terror on Highway 191. We left Denver around 4:30 that afternoon. Emily had made it through her last class of the day and came home flushed with excitement, already listing off places she wanted to stop for photos. I packed the car while she loaded her camera gear. We had bottled water snacks, our overnight bags, and a handwritten map I'd marked with gas stations, rest stops, and emergency services along Highway 191. I didn't tell her I'd memorized the mile markers. I didn't tell her I'd written down the plate number of the truck I'd seen outside our apartment building the last few mornings. I didn't want to scare her. I just wanted us out. It was already dark when we passed through Monticello. That part of Utah has this kind of quiet that feels too big to measure open sky sagebrush on either side of the road and not another car for miles. I kept checking the rearview mirror every few minutes. Emily had dozed off around 8:15, her hoodie pulled up, camera still on her lap. She always did that, held onto it like someone might steal it even in her sleep. I remember thinking as we passed the exit for Devil's Canyon that we were finally in the clear. Then the headlights appeared behind us. No high beams, no swerving, just steady. I figured it was a local or maybe another traveler headed north. But when we stopped at the gas station in Blanding around 900 and I looked out toward the pumps, that same truck was parked across from us, dark green or black late model pickup. Windows tinted, engine running, no driver in sight. Emily came in with me and I noticed she stayed closer than usual. We bought 2 sodas, some trail mix, and I asked the clerk, a college-age guy with tired eyes, if there were any well-lit rest stops between there and Moab. He looked at me a little confused, then shrugged and said the next real place was at least 40 minutes out. I glanced out the window again. The truck was still there. As we walked back to the car, I felt something shift in my gut. That kind of shift where you know you're not just being paranoid, you're being watched. But when I looked back, the truck was gone. We pulled back onto the road at 9:22. The highway out of Blanding is straight for a long stretch, and I was alert the whole way, checking side mirrors, watching for headlights. For a while, there was nothing. Just us and the open road. Emily was thumbing through a photography magazine by the light of her phone. She hadn't said much since we left the gas station. I think she felt it too. Around 10:45, somewhere south of Moab, the same truck reappeared in my rearview mirror. No headlights at first, just the shape. Then they flicked on low beams, not close, but pacing us. Every time I changed lanes or slowed slightly, they adjusted. Not tailgating, just there. Watching. I told Emily quietly to put her phone down. She looked up, saw my face, and knew. She turned around in her seat to check behind us, then whispered, "That's the truck from Blanding." I nodded. We tried to stay calm. I told her to take my phone and start dialing. I remember the way her hands shook trying to type in the numbers. She held it up to my ear. The dispatcher's voice came on Michelle, I learned later. I gave her our location best I could. Mile markers were hard to see in the dark, but I said we were on 191 heading north, maybe 20 miles from Moab. I gave her my name, the car make and model. She asked for details. I said there was a truck behind us, same one we'd seen hours ago now, following close. Emily leaned toward the phone and said, "They're getting closer." That's when we heard the engine behind us rev. Not a lot, but enough to hear it shift up. They were closing the gap. I told the dispatcher I thought he was trying to ram us. Then the line went dead. Not a click, not a hang-up, just silence like the signal got wiped out. I tried calling back but got nothing. I looked down. The battery icon was fine. Service bars were gone. That part of the highway has blind spots, sure. But something about it felt wrong, like it was being blocked. I told Emily to hold on. I didn't know what else to do but keep driving. The truck fell back for a bit, then surged forward again. I didn't want to pull over, didn't want to lead them somewhere we couldn't be seen. At one point, I spotted what looked like a ranch access road up ahead. I faked a turn signal, hoping to throw him off, then veered back onto the main road. He followed. I don't remember the exact minute we saw the roadside emergency phone sign, only that I felt some flicker of hope. We were close to Moab. Someone would see us. I told Emily to get ready to jump if anything happened. I remember her nodding quiet and still hands braced against the dash. And then, without warning, the car jerked. Not from me. Not the engine. Just a sudden stutter like the power dropped out. The dash lights flickered. Steering went heavy. I pulled over instinctively, trying to keep us straight. As soon as we stopped, Emily started reaching for her camera. She said she could get a picture of the plate. But the truck had stopped too, 20 feet behind us, just far enough that we couldn't see the driver. The lights stayed on. Engine idled. No door opened. No one stepped out. I kept my hand on the gear shift foot, hovering over the gas, but the car wouldn't start again. Just that dry, clicking sound. Emily whispered, "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. I just kept watching the truck through the mirror. Then I saw the driver's door open, just one silhouette tall, moving slow. I reached for the phone again. Still no service. Emily said something then, but I couldn't hear it. My ears were roaring. I don't remember what I said to her, only that I reached over and locked the doors. Everything else blurred out. What I remember next more than anything was the smell of dust. Not from the highway, from outside the car, like dry earth being disturbed, like someone was dragging something through it. I looked at her, and she looked at me. The light inside the car made our faces look pale like wax. And then it all went dark. The battery finally died. Headlights gone. Radio dead. No sound but the wind and the slow crunch of footsteps on gravel getting closer. We weren't going to make it to Reno, but no one knew that yet. Not the dispatcher, not my sister, not anyone. It would be another 7 hours before a trucker called in a vehicle abandoned near mile marker 127. Hazard lights still blinking. Engine dead. No sign of anyone inside. Just the soft imprint of tire tracks behind us, and the trail of 2 sets of footprints leading out into the desert. Only one of them ever came back. I was still in Reno when the call came. Saturday morning, just after 10. Caroline picked up first. She'd been pacing since sunrise and handed me the phone without a word. It was a deputy out of San Juan County, Utah. He said a vehicle matching my car had been found abandoned on the shoulder of Highway 191 hazard lights on no one inside. A trucker had spotted it around mile marker 127. My voice caught before I could ask. He repeated it slowly, like he knew what I was trying not to say out loud. "We haven't found your daughter or granddaughter." I was already packing a bag. Caroline insisted on coming with me. It's a 10-hour drive from Reno to Moab if you don't stop, and I don't remember a single tree or town along the way. Just white lines and what-ifs. When we got there, an officer met us at the sheriff's department. His name was Ray Coleman, Detective Coleman. Late 40s, maybe older, with the kind of eyes that don't look away. He brought us into a quiet room. No windows, no clock. He asked questions first. When did I last speak with them? Did I know anyone who might want to harm them? Had Sarah mentioned feeling unsafe? I told him about the letters. I told him I'd begged Sarah to come early to leave the state before anything happened. He nodded like he already knew all that. Said he'd spoken to a detective in Denver who'd filed the original harassment report. 6 letters over 6 weeks. No fingerprints, no DNA, no direct threats. The case had been classified as non-criminal surveillance. I didn't know what to say to that. Coleman leaned back in his chair, folded his hands together, and said, "In my experience, people don't leave behind wallets, phones, and full gas tanks unless someone makes them." He told me they'd brought in dogs and choppers within hours. 50 people had combed both sides of the highway from mile marker 120 to 130. Nothing. No bags. No tire ruts, no drag marks. The car had been locked but not forced. Keys in the ignition. Both phones still charging. Cameras untouched. Purse on the seat. Emily's backpack in the back. Not even a gum wrapper out of place. The only sign of anything off was a second set of tire impressions behind the car, 20 feet back. Wider wheelbase, pulled in fast left in a hurry. The gravel had kicked up on one side. And beside those footprints, 2 sets small walking away from the car, 1 set bigger walking behind them. Coleman looked me in the eye then and said, "We think they were taken." He told me that Sarah's 911 call had come in just before midnight, lasted 47 seconds before it cut out. The dispatcher heard a younger voice say something about a truck. Then the line went dead. Cell towers put the call roughly near where the car was found, but not exact. It bothered him, he said, that 20-mile discrepancy. Either they were taken right there and the car was dumped later, or someone made it look that way. I asked him how often women went missing on that highway. He said it wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of. I think he was trying to be honest without scaring me. It didn't matter. I was already scared. They opened a command post in Moab by Monday morning. Posters went up. Roadblocks were set. A local motel offered rooms for the volunteers. Caroline and I stayed there while the searches went on. Coleman gave daily briefings, always careful with his words. We are pursuing every lead. We are analyzing every piece of evidence. We are not ruling anything out. He never said what I needed to hear, that they were close, that they were alive. Calls started coming in after the news picked it up. People from across the state saying they'd seen a green truck, a nervous teenager, a woman who matched Sarah's description at a rest stop in Price or a diner outside Grand Junction. Most of it went nowhere. But 12 Days in Coleman got a call that made him pause. It was from a long-haul driver named Ken Walsh calling from Texas. He'd been headed south through Utah that night, somewhere north of Blanding. Said he remembered seeing a dark pickup riding real close behind a small car. He couldn't say what kind of car exactly, just that it was weaving a little, like the driver was nervous. Said the pickup didn't pass, just kept its distance hugging the lane. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, just another case of someone pushing on the highway. But when he saw the story online, the location stuck in his head. Coleman asked him about plates, bumper stickers, anything he might have seen. Walsh said no, it was dark and he'd been focused on his own load. But he was sure of the timing, close to midnight. That was enough to place Sarah and Emily's car still in motion after the last phone call. It changed the theory. The gas station clerk from Blanding had already given his statement, said Sarah and Emily had come in looking nervous, asked about lit rest stops, bought sodas. He hadn't mentioned anything unusual at first. But when Coleman pressed again 2 years later, I'd learned the clerk admitted to seeing a man photographing their car from the pump next to theirs. Never reported it, said he didn't want to get involved. That detail didn't come out until much later. Too late. Coleman stayed on the case through winter, then spring. He had a map on his office wall with every sighting, every phone ping, every piece of ground they'd searched. I saw at once lines crisscrossed like someone had been trying to connect invisible dots. He told me he'd requested handwriting analysis on the letters. They'd been turned over to the FBI. Could take weeks, maybe months. He said there were patterns someone familiar with their routine. The writing was clean block letters, no smudges, like someone trained not to leave prints. Maybe military, maybe law enforcement. It was just a guess, but it stuck with me. Because if the person who took them knew how to erase a trail, they'd already had a head start. Months, maybe longer. Caroline and I drove the highway every few days after the searches scaled back. Parked by the spot where they'd found the car. Left a photo on the mile marker. Lit a candle. She brought one of Emily's bracelets and tied it to a branch. The wind was sharp out there, dry and bitter. We didn't stay long. I remember Coleman walking the edge of the shoulder, crouching to look at something only he could see. He picked up a small stone, turned it in his hand, and said, "The desert doesn't always give things back." He meant it quietly, not cruelly. But I knew then. No one was coming to find them but us. And even we didn't know where to look. The last thing Coleman said before we left Moab that spring was that he'd keep the case open on his desk. Said he reviewed it every month. He believed in patterns in patients, in the idea that someone always slips up. I wanted to believe that too. But as the seasons turned and the phone stayed silent, belief started to feel like a chore. Like something you hold up just long enough for the silence to settle back in. And then 1 year later, that silence was broken by a man with a badge and a question no one had thought to ask. Not yet, but soon. Coleman stayed on the case longer than anyone expected. After the first 3 months, the volunteers thinned out, the news cycle moved on, and even the flyers at gas stations began to curl and fade. But he kept showing up. Every couple of weeks, I'd get a call from him. Sometimes there was a new lead, a possible sighting in Cortez, a vehicle match near Price, a clerk who remembered a camera bag. But most of the time, there was nothing. He'd just ask how I was doing, whether I remembered any details Sarah might have mentioned in passing. I think he knew I was holding on by routine. I still made the drive every year to that stretch of road outside Moab. Parked just past mile marker 127 and walked the dirt on either side. You can see the tracks faintly if you know where to look where the patrol officer had found them that first morning. Emily's sneakers had left shallow inward-pointing prints. Sarah's were right beside hers. The larger ones trailed behind them, spaced just a little too far apart. That part of the desert doesn't change quickly. Wind smooths the surface, but underneath the impressions stay. I'd stand out there in the silence and try to imagine their last words, whether they were comforting each other, whether they thought someone might still come looking. For me, time slowed down after that first year. It stopped being about finding them alive. It became about finding anything. A bracelet, a hairpin, a thread. I didn't care if it was broken. I just needed something real. Coleman retired in early 2016. The department brought in a younger detective named Lisa Rodriguez. I met her that spring. She was sharp, quieter than Coleman, but focused. She'd read the entire case file twice before our first meeting. Had the photos spread out in front of her when I walked in. Sarah's Honda, the inside untouched. A zoomed-in shot of the tire tracks. A grainy security frame from the Blanding station showing Emily looking up at her mother, the sodas on the counter. Rodriguez didn't offer false hope. She said she believed the abduction had been deliberate, that whoever did it knew the route had surveillance, maybe even intercepted phone signals. She told me about a new federal database being tested designed to flag repeat patterns across jurisdictions. Cases that might look unrelated on paper but show common threads. She said the Mitchell case was one of the first they submitted. 12 possible hits came back over the next 2 years. She looked into each one personally. Missing women in Arizona. Unexplained vehicle abandonments in western Colorado, a cold case out of southern Nevada. Nothing connected. Nothing stuck. I could tell it weighed on her. Every year she made time to walk the site with me. No press, no promises, just quiet. She carried a small field notebook and wrote things down as I spoke, even if I repeated myself. Said sometimes patterns don't show up until the 5th or 6th telling. She was the one who had the letters re-examined. The FBI had done an initial pass years back, but Rodriguez asked for a deeper profile, something behavioral. They flagged a few things. The lettering was uniform clean. All block print written with a steady hand. The person was likely left-handed with formal training, possibly military or someone who'd filled out official forms for years. The messages had come from 6 different towns, but all along the same stretch of highway Sarah and Emily had traveled. That stuck with me. Someone had mapped the route before they did. It wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was something else. Rodriguez didn't say it out loud, but I could hear it in the way she phrased things. This person hadn't stumbled on them. He'd waited. I still kept Sarah and Emily's numbers active. Every month I paid the bills. Part of me knew they wouldn't ring, but I couldn't bring myself to shut them off. On holidays, I'd send messages, just short ones. Love you. Still here. The phones stayed silent, but I kept sending them anyway. Sarah would have turned 50 that October. Emily would have been 26. Sometimes I'd catch myself calculating the age difference between who they were and who they would be now. What kind of photos Emily would be taking, whether Sarah might have started dating again. It's strange what the mind clings to when there's no ending. One winter, I got a call from an old friend of Sarah's. She said she'd seen a woman in a parking lot in Santa Fe who looked just like her, same hair, same walk, even wore the same kind of work shoes Sarah always wore at the dental office. She tried to follow her, but the woman got into a car and drove off. She swore it was her. I passed it to Rodriguez, and she checked with local cameras and plate readers. It wasn't a match. Still, I caught myself staring at strangers more after that. Every grocery store, every post office, always half expecting a hand to reach out, always listening for her voice. The fourth year was the hardest. The calls came less often. New detectives rotated in and out. The case file grew thick but stale. Rodriguez did what she could, but I could tell they were moving on to newer cases. That's the part no one talks about. Not the search, not the loss, but the long, empty hallway of waiting. And the shame that creeps in when you start to wonder if you've remembered them wrong, if you've imagined pieces that never happened. I started waking up with this recurring thought, what if they were just gone? Not taken. Not hurt. Just gone. But every time I went back to that place on the highway, I knew better. There was something unfinished out there. Something that hadn't come up yet. I could feel it. The wind still moved the same way. The air still had weight. And in 2023, that weight finally shifted. A man with a hobby, a shovel, and a metal detector was about to stumble onto something buried deep in the desert, a box sealed with tape and silence. And inside the first sentence of an answer I hadn't let myself hope for. His name was Marcus Brandon, retired structural engineer from Phoenix, 68 years old, no criminal record, no family in Utah. Just a quiet man with a quiet hobby. He'd been metal detecting since his early 30s, mostly for coins, sometimes for arrowheads. But after retirement, he started getting more serious. Desert areas were his preference, less ground cover, fewer false signals. That March, he'd parked his SUV about 15 miles southeast of Moab, well beyond any marked trails. He'd read about abandoned mining roads in that area and thought it might lead to something overlooked. It was his third day out there when he picked up the signal. Steady, low tone. He described it later as too clean to be junk, too strong to ignore. He started digging around 9 in the morning. By 10, he'd hit something solid. It was a metal ammunition box, military style, maybe 10 inches deep and half as long across, wrapped tight in plastic sheeting, duct tape over the edges. He thought maybe it was an old supply cache or a prepper's stash. He peeled the tape off and opened the lid. Inside, right on top, were 2 driver's licenses, Sarah's and Emily's, side by side. Photos untouched, names clear. He recognized them immediately, said he'd followed the case back when it happened, had watched one of the televised press conferences. But that wasn't what made his hands shake. Beneath the licenses were a few personal items, a silver bracelet with a clasp shaped like a butterfly, Emily's 16th birthday gift, and Sarah's wedding band still bright despite the years underground. And then, at the very bottom of the box, a small black and white composition notebook, half full. The first page was dated 2 days after their disappearance. The handwriting was square legible, printed in all caps. The entry began with the words, Day 1. I have them now. Marcus stopped reading after the first paragraph. He sealed the box back up and hiked a half-mile uphill to get a phone signal. The 911 call came through at 1:12 p.m. I think I just found something related to that missing mother and daughter. It's real. You need to send someone now. Rodriguez was on site within 2 hours. She didn't wait. The area was taped photographs taken and the box flown out by helicopter before nightfall. I got the call that same evening. She didn't tell me everything over the phone, just that something significant had been found in the desert, and that she believed it was real. That was all I needed to hear. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up in the motel chair with the TV on mute, just watching headlights pass on the highway. The next morning, Rodriguez brought the notebook in with her. She said the entries went on for 6 days. She didn't read it out loud, but she summarized the key points carefully like she'd practiced how to say them. The writer was a man. He referred to himself only by the initials TK. He believed he had rescued Sarah and Emily from the outside world. Said they were safe in the compound. He described leading them down into an underground space, somewhere remote, somewhere secure. Rodriguez said it read like delusion, but structured, planned. There were references to food stores, water supplies, even sleeping arrangements. He believed what he was doing made sense. He'd written things like, "They don't understand yet," and "Emily needs time to adjust." I asked how he knew their names. She just nodded. He knew them. He'd been watching. The earlier entries made references to Denver, to Sarah's work schedule, to Emily's school. He even described the red sweater she wore one day. The level of detail matched the letters from 2013. It was the same person. And he hadn't just sent those notes, he'd written them from a place of obsession. Rodriguez turned the notebook over and showed me the back inside cover. 4 sets of numbers, GPS coordinates. The last set was circled twice. That's where the compound was. They moved fast. A federal search team mobilized that afternoon. By nightfall, they had the entrance flagged. It had been covered with loose stones and camouflaged with soil. If you weren't standing directly over it, you'd never see it. The access point dropped down 15 feet into a reinforced shaft, part of an old mining corridor that had been sealed off decades ago. This one had been reopened. Lights wired in. Dry storage areas. Bunks. A portable generator. The first chamber was about 20 feet wide, maybe 12 feet across, cut into the stone with what looked like professional tools. There were signs of habitation. 2 sets of restraints. A table, some worn clothing. Everything was documented carefully. Then they found the message. It had been scratched into one of the stone walls low to the ground near where the restraints were anchored. It read, "Sarah and Emily Garrett were here. We fought hard. Find us." The letters weren't deep, but they were deliberate. Nearby, they found what looked like the tip of a broken tent stake filed to a point. They think that's what she used to carve it. I asked if it was Sarah's handwriting. Rodriguez didn't answer right away. Then she nodded. "I believe so," she said. "Or Emily's. Either way, they wanted to be remembered." I went out there 3 days later. They wouldn't let me into the compound, but I stood at the entrance while they brought things up in labeled evidence bags. One of the searchers, a woman around my age, took her gloves off and walked over to me. She said, "They didn't give up. Not once." I nodded, but I couldn't say anything back. My mouth wouldn't open. Later, Rodriguez showed me one last thing from the notebook. It wasn't part of the daily entries. It had been written on the inside of the front cover like a note to himself. It said, "She made him a criminal. She left me no choice." That was the sentence. That was the moment everything shifted. Someone hadn't just taken them. He'd convinced himself he had a right to. I looked at Rodriguez and said, "So now you know who it was?" She didn't blink. She just replied, "We're close." I believed her. She already knew where to look, and she'd been looking for a long time. Rodriguez didn't say his name right away. She just laid the file on the table, opened it to the page with the service record, and slid it toward me. I didn't need to read much. I saw the badge number, the agency, and the photograph, short haircut, stiff collar, a blank stare that tried to look official but couldn't quite hide the weight underneath. His name was Thomas Kellerman, age 51, assigned as a deputy U.S. Marshal out of Utah. Rodriguez said he'd been with the Marshal's Service for over 2 decades, mostly serving warrants, prisoner transports, the occasional fugitive recovery. On paper, he was clean. Not exemplary, but stable. Trusted. And for a man like him, access wasn't just about databases, it was about presence. He could be anywhere in any state with any excuse. No one would question him. He wasn't on their radar early on. He didn't live in Moab. He didn't work in the same county where Sarah and Emily disappeared. But what finally connected him to the case was something small. Something that came out of a deeper forensic review of the notebook. There were 2 offhand references, one about the trial, another about her testimony. Both tied back to an older case in Denver. In 2011, Sarah had testified as a witness in a domestic abuse case. She hadn't known the man involved. She'd just been in the parking lot outside a grocery store and had stepped in when she saw him strike a woman. She gave a statement. Later, she took the stand. The man was convicted. His name was Robert Kellerman, Thomas's brother. That was the link. Quiet buried, but enough to explain motive. Rodriguez said it was clear from the notebook that the obsession had started back then, 2 years before the first letter ever arrived. The notes mentioned how Sarah had turned the system against a good man and how she made him look like a monster. That wasn't about Emily. That was about Robert. And it had festered. After the conviction, Robert served 3 years in state prison. Thomas kept working. But something had shifted. He started using federal resources to track Sarah's movements. Phone records, DMV data. Rodriguez said there was evidence he'd accessed her address history more than once, masked behind legitimate-looking queries. And that was just the official trail. Off the record, he had time authority and knowledge of where the gaps were. He could sit across from a local deputy and never raise a single red flag. That part made my stomach turn. Knowing that while Sarah and I were trading emails about the trip to Reno, he was already planning the intercept, mapping the route, timing the departure, choosing the exact mile of highway where she'd be far enough from help, close enough to vanish. Rodriguez told me there were more entries in the notebook. Some hadn't been shared publicly. They detailed how he'd used a signal jammer to knock out the phones, how he'd staged a mechanical failure ahead of their car to force them off the road. The abduction wasn't chaotic, it was systematic, controlled. He even noted what Sarah said in the final moments. She was calm, he wrote, tried to shield the girl. I admire that. I don't know why that part hit me the hardest. Maybe because it confirmed what I already believed, that Sarah was still protecting Emily, even when she had nothing left to give. Rodriguez didn't stop there. She pulled up another page. This one had a date written at the top, December 15th, 2013. It was 8 days after the disappearance. It read, I have to leave for a few days. There's a warrant in Colorado I can't ignore. I've left them food and water. Locks are secure. They know better than to try anything. That was the last entry. Rodriguez said she'd cross-checked that date with travel records, and what she found closed the loop. On December 15th, 2013, at 2:38 p.m., Thomas Kellerman was involved in a fatal accident along I-70 during a snowstorm. His vehicle had skidded off a bridge and dropped into a ravine near Glenwood Canyon. The wreck was discovered 3 days later once the weather cleared. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma. He died instantly. No autopsy flagged anything suspicious. No one at the time connected him to any open case. He was buried with full honors. Rodriguez looked at me steady and quiet and said, they were still alive when he died. I didn't respond. I don't think I could. My mind was stuck on the timing, the week that followed, the food and water he'd left behind, the sound of wind scraping against a metal door in the middle of nowhere with no one coming back through it. The compound had been designed to hold them, not sustain them. The water supply was limited. The food shelf life wasn't built for months. They found one of the jugs overturned, a cracked lid, and a trail of dried sediment leading to the corner where Emily's sleeping area had been. They found scratch marks along the rear corridor where someone, likely Sarah, had tried to force open a side passage. Rodriguez said she came within inches of breaching an older tunnel. If she'd had another tool, if she'd known where to press. But she didn't. And the longer I listened, the more I realized the cruelest part wasn't how it ended. It was how close they came to escaping. Emily had tried to run once, according to the notebook, on day 5. She made it out of the compound, climbed partway through a canyon wash, but collapsed from dehydration before she could get to the ridgeline. He wrote about how he found her, carried her back, told her the desert wouldn't forgive her for trying. That line made Rodriguez clench her jaw. He wanted to be their savior, she said, even as he imprisoned them. The press didn't get those details. Not all of them. The official statement described Kellerman as a lone actor, a federal employee who exploited his position for personal revenge. But to me, he was just a man with a key, a plan, and too much time to follow through on it. We stood in silence for a while after she finished. The evidence bags had been boxed, the notebook locked away, the coordinates sealed, but I could still feel the weight of it like the air in that room had thickened around us. Rodriguez walked me out to the parking lot. Before I got into the car, she said one last thing. I think Sarah knew. The moment they stopped, I think she knew what this was. And she still tried to leave a trail. I nodded. Because that was Sarah. She didn't need a guarantee. She just needed a chance. And that chance, buried 3 feet down in red dirt, had finally come up for air. They found them on the 4th day of excavation. The interior of the compound was more extensive than anyone expected. 3 chambers linked by narrow corridors, all reinforced with steel brackets and bolted paneling. Whatever Kellerman had done, he hadn't rushed it. The final room was sealed by a heavy door not locked, but wedged shut with a plank from the inside. When the team removed it, they found signs of struggle, scrape marks along the base, smudged prints on the walls where someone had pushed until their hands bled, and then in the furthest corner, curled against the caved-in wall beside an empty water jug and a worn jacket, Sarah's body. Emily was just a few feet away, her head resting on a folded sweatshirt, her bracelet still around her wrist. No signs of trauma, no visible wounds. The medical examiner would later confirm they died of dehydration and exposure. Slowly, quietly. Sarah had survived longer, most likely by rationing what was left, maybe even giving what she could to her daughter. There were no final notes, no diary entries, just the markings on the stone and the faint outline of days counted in scratches near the corner of the wall. Rodriguez told me the timeline matched what they'd feared. Emily likely died first sometime around the 10th or 11th day. Sarah may have held on 2 or 3 more. It was winter. The temperatures inside the compound had dropped low enough at night to sap strength quickly. The flashlight found beside them had dead batteries. No spares nearby. There were still canned supplies stacked against the back wall, but no can opener. No tools. Nothing left that they hadn't already tried. Rodriguez said she believed Sarah had broken the second restraint using a length of metal she'd pulled from a ventilation grate. It was bent in half, splintered at one end. They found it beside a patch of stone where she'd worked loose a narrow gap barely the size of a fist, but enough to catch a draft of outside air. That's likely what kept her conscious as long as she was. She never gave up. Not until her body gave out. The remains were taken back to Denver under escort. I went with them. I didn't want them to be alone on the final leg. When we reached the coroner's office, I asked if I could see the items recovered from the site. It wasn't a request I made lightly, but there was something about knowing what had been left behind, touching the last pieces of them that felt necessary. The evidence technician handed me a sealed tray. Inside were 2 sets of clothing, both faded. The camera bag Emily had packed, the bracelet, and Sarah's ring still slightly tarnished but intact. I held it for a long time. Rodriguez sat beside me and said quietly, "She probably took it off to keep it safe." Somewhere in her mind, she thought she might need it again. I nodded, because I knew she would have believed that they might still come home. The funeral was small. Just family, a few close friends, and some of the officers who'd worked the case across the years. Rodriguez stood in the back, said nothing, but stayed through the entire service. We buried them together side by side under a grove of pines in the northeast corner of the cemetery. It was quiet that morning. Overcast. A soft wind moved through the branches above us. I read a passage Sarah had always liked, something from a book she used to keep on the coffee table. Emily's photo sat at the edge of the podium. That same smile, that same flash of knowing in her eyes. It took weeks before I could visit again. But when I did, I brought the bracelet. I laid it at the base of the stone and said her name out loud. Just once. The press started circling after the burial. There were interviews, feature stories, a podcast. People wanted to know how something like this could happen, how a U.S. Marshal could use his position to stalk, abduct, and trap two innocent women without being caught. The official answer was bureaucracy. Kellerman had been under quiet investigation in late 2013 for misuse of access. Internal Affairs had flagged unusual database queries but hadn't prioritized the review. When he died in the crash, the file was closed. No one thought to connect him to Sarah's case, not until the notebook surfaced. Rodriguez testified before a Senate subcommittee later that year. She spoke plainly with the same calm I'd come to expect from her. She advocated for changes in how internal investigations are tracked across jurisdictions, how missing person cases involving potential law enforcement misconduct are escalated, and how behavioral warning signs shouldn't be dismissed just because someone wears a badge. A federal bill passed the following spring. They named it the Garrett Act. I didn't ask for that, I didn't need it. But I hope it helps someone. There's a foundation now, too, set up by a group of volunteers who followed the case online for years. They raise money for families searching for loved ones, especially in cases that go cold. It's not big, but it's steady. Quiet work like Sarah used to do. The day the search team returned to the site one last time just to clear out the last equipment, one of them found something unexpected. Wedged into a crevice in the far wall, barely visible unless you crouched down and turned your head just so, was a torn scrap of fabric. Denim, probably from a jacket. It had a single word inked onto it in permanent marker. Remember, no date, no name, just that. We don't know who wrote it. Might have been Emily. Might have been Sarah. It could have even been something Kellerman left behind, though I don't believe that. Whoever it was, they knew someone would come looking. And I did. I always did. The investigation didn't end when they closed the file. Not really. It just changed direction. Officially, the Garrett case was resolved. Sarah and Emily found the timeline confirmed, the perpetrator identified. But for Rodriguez and for me, there was still one question that kept circling back. How had no one caught him? How had Thomas Kellerman managed to build an underground holding space, use federal tools to track them, and then vanish into the desert, with no one questioning it until a metal detector beeped? 10 years later, Rodriguez kept going through Kellerman's personnel file in the weeks after the compound was uncovered. She'd already requested internal reports, flagged queries, anything that might show warning signs. Most of what she got was redacted, but tucked inside a dated folder labeled Conduct Review, 2013, was a printed memo from a supervising officer, something that hadn't been scanned into the digital system. It noted Kellerman's access patterns had been irregular with one specific citation. Multiple inquiries into DMV records for a Denver address unrelated to any active case. He'd explained it away as a training exercise. The review stalled. The timing of that memo, November 14th. Just one day before Sarah and Emily disappeared. Rodriguez shared that with me quietly. She didn't say much. She just looked down at the page and said, "They almost caught him." There was more. A personal laptop had been recovered from Kellerman's home after his death. It had been inventoried and returned to the family. No one thought to examine it for case relevance. When Rodriguez tracked it down again, she found a folder titled Reclamation. Inside were dozens of documents. Hand-drawn floor plans. Satellite images of the Utah desert. Supply lists. Even spreadsheets of fuel consumption for different routes from Denver. He'd planned everything. But one file stood out. It was a PDF scanned blurry and watermarked in a way Rodriguez recognized immediately. It was a sealed copy of the court transcript from Robert Kellerman's trial. Somehow Thomas had obtained it. It included Sarah's full testimony. That's when Rodriguez called me. She didn't ask anything, just said, "I think you need to see this." We met at the precinct late that evening. It was quiet, Most of the staff had gone home. She brought the printout in a sealed folder and sat beside me while I read. Sarah had never told me the details of that testimony, just that she'd seen a man hitting a woman in a parking lot and stepped in. But the transcript showed more. She'd called 911. She'd stayed with the woman while waiting for the police. She'd taken down the license plate number. When asked if she felt safe testifying, she'd said yes, because it's the right thing to do. It was one sentence, one clear, unwavering sentence. I could imagine her saying it calm, certain, and I could imagine Thomas reading it over and over, twisting it in his mind. The profile the FBI had built left-handed structured thinker with a likely fixation on moral inversion suddenly made perfect sense. He hadn't just seen Sarah as a threat. He saw her as the reason his brother lost everything. The journal was his version of rewriting that story. The compound his attempt to restore control. There was one last entry on the laptop, a Word document untitled. It wasn't dated. It read, "She'll thank me someday, when she understands what I protected them from. The noise, the lies, the decay. I gave them peace." Rodriguez printed it and filed it with the rest of the case materials. She didn't editorialize. She just placed it at the end of the binder and marked it "Final Statement." After that, the official work slowed. The federal investigation into procedural failure wrapped up with quiet recommendations and a few internal disciplinary actions. Nothing public, nothing wide-reaching. But the mood within the Marshals Service shifted. A policy change came down 6 months later, requiring mandatory cross-departmental reviews for any flagged access into non-criminal records. It wasn't much, but it was something. The Garrett Act passed in the spring. I was there when the president signed it. I stood at the back of the room. I didn't speak. I didn't want to. The legislation created new federal oversight into how law enforcement officers use surveillance tools, especially in cases involving women and minors. It was named after Sarah and Emily, but it wasn't about honoring them. It was about protecting the people still out there, the ones no one's looking for yet. In the weeks that followed, I found myself going back through boxes I hadn't opened in years. Photographs, handwritten cards, Emily's film rolls from her high school photography class. One was labeled Desert Light. I hadn't noticed it before. I took it to a local shop that still processes film. A week later, I picked up the prints. They were soft, sun-faded images of southern Colorado high desert plains, long stretches of open highway. One shot stopped me. It was of Sarah's Honda parked beside a lonely gas station. Emily must have stepped out to take it while Sarah pumped gas. In the frame, barely visible behind them, was a dark truck. No license plate. Just a shape, low-slung and distant. It could have been nothing. Or it could have been the first time she caught him without even realizing it. I brought the photo to Rodriguez. She stared at it for a long time. Then she flipped it over. Emily had written something on the back. A date and 2 words. "Still watching." Rodriguez didn't say anything. She just nodded once and placed it inside a separate envelope marked for the Foundation archives. That was the last new piece of evidence we ever found. There would be no trial, no formal justice. Kellerman died before he could face any of it. But there was something in the way Rodriguez carried the case forward, something that said, justice doesn't always come in courtrooms. Sometimes it comes in quiet correction, in names remembered, in safeguards built, and in the faces of strangers who now know what to look for. That's what stayed with me. Not the fear, not the horror, but the shape of something returned to the light, something no longer hidden. And still some nights I think about that box in the dirt sealed with tape and silence, and how close it came to staying buried. If not for the wind, if not for the metal detector, if not for a man who bent down and decided to dig. I still keep Sarah's ring in the top drawer of my nightstand, not because I need to see it every day, but because knowing it's close, that something of hers made it home, helps me sleep a little easier. Emily's bracelet is in a frame beside the last photo she ever took, the one with the gas station behind them and the truck in the distance. You can barely make it out, but it's there. Sometimes I wonder if she saw it, if she felt it, whatever was creeping in behind the edges. I've stopped asking why it happened the way it did. That question doesn't hold the weight it used to. Some people break the world quietly, and sometimes the only thing louder than violence is the silence it leaves behind. Sarah wasn't loud. She wasn't the kind of person who demanded attention. But she noticed everything. The people around her, the things that didn't feel right, the ones who looked like they were about to fall through the cracks. She stood up when it counted, even when no one else did. And Emily, she carried that same clarity. She saw light in empty places, took pictures of rusted fences, cracked windows, sun-baked concrete, the parts of the world everyone else forgot. She was 17 when she vanished, 26 when we brought her home. Her life stopped in a hidden room beneath the desert, but her name didn't. Neither did her mother's. After the foundation started, I heard from people I never expected, parents still searching, survivors who came back different, officers who remembered a detail too late. They all had stories not just about what went wrong, but about what they carried through it. That's what I hold on to now. Not just the memory of Sarah and Emily, but the shape of what they left behind. A story that didn't disappear. A truth that didn't stay buried. The last time I visited the site, the entrance was sealed. The desert had already started reclaiming it. Dust wind, a slow erasure. But I brought a small stone with me. I'd picked it up from the edge of the cemetery back home. Smooth gray, nothing special. I left it just beyond where the door used to be, under a ridge of red clay. No plaque, no inscription. Just something placed there with care. A reminder that they were here. That they were real. If this story stayed with you, I hope you'll share it. Not for views, not for headlines, but so their names and others like them don't get lost in the noise. Someone always remembers. Sometimes that's what brings them home.